welcome everyone. My name is Leah and I am the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator here at Women's Shelters Canada, and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. We have some great speakers, great information to take in and to discuss today. I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I know there are people joining this webinar from all across Turtle Island, or the northern part of Turtle Island at least. So please feel free to let us know where you're joining from in the chat. And as you do so, you can choose to set your chat in the to line to either all panelists and attendees or just to panelists. So if you want everyone to see it, you can choose all panelists and attendees. So let us know where you're joining us from. And I think it's really important, especially to start today's discussion with that acknowledgement. We're talking about homelessness and violence against women, which are really intertwined issues and, prominent issues facing Indigenous women, as we know. And so I think it is important to reflect on how people are impacted differently by these issues, how ongoing settler colonialism has kind of created this situation where, Indigenous people can be homeless on what is their traditional unceded territories. So just wanted to start off with that reflection. So a few housekeeping reminders before we really jump into things here. You have probably noticed that you can only see myself, you can hear me speaking, but you can't speak and your video is off. We have quite a few people with us on the webinar today, and we want to make sure that everyone can hear the presenters. And so to keep the audio quality really strong, we're going to stick with only the presenters having their mics and audio on. But that doesn't mean we don't want you to participate. We really do. So the ways you can do that, you can see there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen, and you can send messages in there to let us know who you are, where you are, comment, share an experience, anything along those lines. Just a reminder, you can choose to send to either all panelists, in which case only the panelists will see, or all panelists and attendees. You'll also see at the bottom a Q&A box, and this is where we want you to put your questions for our presenters today. Putting them in the Q&A instead of the chat makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of those questions and make sure we can cover them all. So please do put your questions in there, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentations. So, as you know, today we are here to talk about homelessness and VAW and looking at how those two sectors do share so many similarities, but have often worked in silos. And so we want to look at that a bit. We want to look at the potential for collaboration between the two sectors. And we thought this would be really interesting to take a look at because for many women, those two issues are so intertwined, they don't necessarily fit into those neat boxes. So our first speaker today will be Dr. Kaitlin Schwan, Director of Research at The Shift and co-author of the recently released fascinating report on the state of women's housing need and homelessness in Canada, which I think she'll tell us more about soon. And then we're going to hear from Martine Dore, the Interim Executive Director at Cornerstone Housing for Women in Ottawa. And Martine has extensive experience in both the women's homelessness sector and the domestic violence sector. So she'll speak to us kind of from both of those sectors and her experience moving between the two. And then we're going to have a question period to really, hear from you and get your questions and have a bit of a discussion. So we're excited to get started. Before we do, we want to hear from you and get to know who you are. So I'm going to put out a little poll question here. It should be popping up on your screen, and you can just select your answer and submit down at the bottom there. And so we're asking, does your shelter or transition house serve mostly women experiencing homelessness or domestic violence, or a little bit of both? And we would love to know. I'm going to keep it open a little longer, give a few more people a chance to vote. And if it's not popping up for you, you might be able to click on poll at the bottom of your screen and see it there. So most people have voted. I'll give it 5 more seconds. Okay. So as you can see here, we have about 59% of you who say you're mostly serving women experiencing domestic violence, and 41% who are saying both. So that's pretty evenly split. And I think that gives us a great sort of range for our conversation here today. So thank you so much for participating in that. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kaitlin, and I will just put up your PowerPoint.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm coming to you from a city known as Guelph, Ontario, which is on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, First Nation, and of the Anishinaabe people. So certainly want to extend my deep gratitude for having me on their land today and for having the opportunity to be here with Women's Shelters Canada and with the brilliant Martine and Leah to discuss some of these key issues that I know so many of us are facing in the midst of COVID. From where I'm sitting, this feels like a moment of profound opportunity and profound crisis. It's really become clear the extent to which access to housing is the difference between life and death, and that's always been true for women, but COVID has really exacerbated that in ways I know all of you are living out. So I think it's a beautiful moment for us to be talking about the VAW sector and the homelessness sector coming together and discussing collaboration, coordination, what that can look like, some of the best practices out there. I know Martine has some amazing insights she's going to share about her work. And what I was hoping to do today was walk you through some of the key research findings from the work that we've done at the Women's Network, the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network of Canada, and what I think it might suggest about some of the key challenges we have together and key opportunities for growth. And as I'm talking, feel free to drop questions in the chat and we'll tackle them later. Yeah, so great. So Leah, would you mind switching the slide? Perfect, great. So as you see, I'm really gonna try to give us a high level overview of a few things. I'm gonna talk about the hidden crisis of women's homelessness across Canada and the hidden nature of women's homelessness, talk about some of these shared challenges both sectors have and shared opportunities. And you know, I'm a researcher and I work in the homelessness sector, so I'm really interested in engaging with all of you about what this means for the VAW sector in particular, because I know probably a lot of folks here are working in that sector. It sounds like many of you are also serving women who are experiencing homelessness. So really looking forward to it. Thanks, Leah. Great. So earlier this year has felt so long, but yes, earlier this year, the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network launched this large report that you see there. I'd really encourage you to go and have a look. We have like this monster report and then an exec summary and kind of a shorter brief. But the purpose of this research that I wanted to talk about today was to get a sense of what do we know about women's homelessness in Canada, what don't we know, and kind of create a foundation for us to do a national survey with women and girls and gender diverse folks who are experiencing homelessness across Canada, which is what we're up to right now. So this was a partnership with ourselves at the network, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, Keepers of the Circle, and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. So super lucky to receive funding from CMHC to do this research and try to create, you know, a tangible picture of what we know about women's homelessness. And you can switch the slides, Leah. Thank you. So if you go into the report, there's like 8 key findings. We don't have time to get into all of them today, so I want to touch on a few things. So next slide, please. Yes, okay. So one of the key pieces that came out of this work was the nature of women's homelessness as enormously hidden for a few reasons. So we know that women are much more likely to experience hidden forms of homelessness. But what the research also showed is that because of how we think about homelessness, because of how we define it, because of the kind of data we collect, we also invisibilize women's homelessness. And the combination of those two factors is contributing to the kind of underfunding and overcapacity issues that we're seeing across the sector. And all of you will know this all too well. So next slide. Thanks, Leah. This is really reflected in the national data we have. So one of the interesting things that is very consistent is in homeless shelters across Canada, women are much less likely to show up. They're much less likely to be sleeping outdoors and more likely to be in spaces like hotels or motels. But in general, and this certainly globally, what we know is women are much more likely to exhaust all their informal resources, to rely on informal supports, to kind of go to any length to avoid the homelessness system in particular, and shelters more broadly. And that's for a huge range of reasons. And in our review of the literature, we saw so much data speaking to women talking about remaining in abusive relationships because they felt like it was preferable to, or they really had no choice essentially, but to remain in a situation where they're experiencing the abuse of one man rather than multiple men that they would experience on the streets. Next slide. Thank you. What's also really interesting is when you look at this data, like at a national level, what you see is among children who are in shelters, there's generally some equity with respect to gender, but as folks get older, you see less and less women in these different age groups. So the question is, where are these women going? We know obviously they're facing the same remarkably tight housing rental markets. They're experiencing the effects of the feminization of poverty across Canada, but they really aren't showing up in the homelessness system. And this is in part because their experiences of homelessness are much more likely to be hidden, and they really aren't touching the system. Would you mind next slide, Leah? Thank you. So when we're talking about women's homelessness, we really are talking about hidden homelessness. So I worked with my team to kind of create this little infographic that kind of identifies some of the ways that we need to think about and expand our definition of homelessness. So certainly we need to be thinking about women in situations where they're couch surfing, women in situations where they're living with their employer, women who are experiencing elder abuse. All of these constitute instances of homelessness, but because they're often not thought or framed of in that way, they're not included in our policy responses. And we know that women, girls, and gender diverse folks are more likely to be in overcrowded housing, more likely to be in inadequate housing. So at a national level, we're really looking at a very severe crisis. So what we tried to do, and Leah, would you mind switching the slide, is in our report, try to triangulate, like we have all of these pockets of data, but we don't have a really comprehensive picture of the scale of women's homelessness. But when you pull this together, what you see is that the scale is much larger than we think. And because of the way we study it, because of our focus on point in time counts or the other methods we use to enumerate women's homelessness, we're really not getting a sense of the scale. And that, I think, for both of our sectors, contributes to invisibilizing this issue, makes it extremely challenging at a national level to be doing the kind of advocacy that all of us are engaged in or want to be engaged in. So when we fail to define women's homelessness, or when we fail to define homelessness more broadly in ways that capture some of those hidden homeless elements that we're talking about, we're really seeing a deeply inequitable response to homelessness across the country. So that gives you kind of a sense of where we're at with hidden homelessness, huge implications for both sectors. And now I want to touch on a few of these shared challenges in that context with respect to the VAW and the homelessness sector, where we're at. Certainly, and this will be no surprise to any of you, all of our shelters in the homelessness sector, VAW sector, are absolutely operating at overcapacity. You know, the like federal enumeration or studies of this, like between 2005 and 2014, across the country, found that the Canadian shelter system is operating at 90% capacity. I provided a few statistics there of the situation in Toronto. These are realities all of you know, and these were realities pre-COVID, and we know that that need has really deepened. Next slide. Thanks. And part of this is obviously the issue of the availability of funding and funding disparity. So in the homelessness sector, what you're seeing there in that infographic is that only 13% of beds across Canada are dedicated to women. There is 38% that are general beds in co-ed shelters, but again, what we saw in the research, and you folks will know very well, is experiences of violence or discrimination or other distressing experiences that folks may have in the homelessness system or in the homelessness sector or shelters where it is co-ed. There is, for many women, a serious disincentive to going into a co-ed shelter. And you know, so there's the capacity challenge and the underfunding of these beds, but there's also this additional challenge of having nowhere for women to go once they're transitioning out of emergency housing of various kinds. So next slide. And as you all know, this is because we have such a profound lack of safe, affordable, adequate housing across Canada in general, and really, really limited investment in women's focused housing that's trauma informed. So this study that I'm referencing here in this slide is an amazing study. I'd really encourage all of you to look at it. I kind of want to scream it from the rooftop sometimes. Statistics Canada looked at all of violence against women shelters across Canada on a single day, did like this snapshot methodology in 2018, and found that across 552 shelters, almost 1,000 women and children were being turned away because of capacity issues. And that's a huge number. We can imagine what that looks like over the course of a year. And on that same day, they also looked at where are women going when they're leaving, and found that across Canada, 21% are returning to live with an abuser. 36% didn't know where they were going, and 11% were transitioning into another domestic violence shelter. And we don't have this data in the homelessness sector. We actually don't really know where women go out of the homelessness sector. But we need to be advocating so hard on this, because the profound challenges women have getting into secure housing out of these emergency housing situations is systemic. It's deeply systemic across Canada. It's not their failure. It's not frontline folks' failure. It's this profound housing system failure that all of us are dealing with. Next slide, thank you. A fourth kind of key piece and key challenge for all of us is that we're, in concert with these funding inequities, we're also not funding emergency services and shelters in some of the highest need areas across Canada. So for example, we know in northern communities, in rural communities, in remote communities, there's profound lack of shelter for women, both in the VAW sector and the homelessness sector, despite those areas actually having higher rates of police reported violence against women. This is certainly true in the territories. Next slide. So for example, 70% of northern communities in Canada have no safe houses or emergency shelters for women escaping violence. Indigenous women are enormously impacted by these funding inequities and lack of services across Canada. And as are gender diverse folks who are unable to access shelters for various reasons. So in many cases, geographically, the communities that are in highest needs and demographically were actually deeply underfunded across Canada. Next slide, thank you. Fifth challenge, so I have 6 challenges, but a fifth challenge is eligibility criteria and how that functions across the VAW and homelessness sector, which is like a very challenging in various ways and looks obviously very different in different contexts. But what we found across Canada is that eligibility criteria, who could actually access services, created various barriers for some of the most marginalized women across Canada. So in some cases, having to experience homelessness for a particular length of time, having to experience violence from a particular person, having to present your gender in a particular way, having to be sober, various criteria within the VAW sector and the homelessness sector actually making access to services really challenging. And I know Matt will talk about the tremendous progress that we've made in these areas, especially around harm reduction. But we're continuing to see in these systems a real challenge for some of the most marginalized women. And hence you have a quote like this from a woman in the Yukon who's talking about the violence, her and the kind of length she had to go to access services. And so when we're thinking about solutions to women's homelessness and violence, it's certainly within our sectors, but also reckoning with eligibility criteria in other social service sector spaces. Next slide. Great. And sixth and last challenge, I just want to very briefly touch on this. All of you will know that homelessness, violence are deeply impacted by what is happening in other public systems, in the child welfare system, in the criminal justice system, the ways in which we're seeing anti-Black racism play out in those systems, the ways in which we're seeing colonial settler culture, practices, policies inform how they operate. These do create deep pathways into homelessness and violence for women, girls, and gender diverse folks, but they often don't see themselves as part of the solution to this issue. And certainly we're seeing some of the most severe violence happening for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks. So in the child welfare system, for example, we know if you have your child apprehended, that's statistically a predictor of becoming homeless. If you are a young person who ends up in the child welfare system, you're actually 193 times more likely to become homeless. If you're a child in the child welfare system, you're much more likely to have your child apprehended, and women are also avoiding shelters or services for fear of the apprehension of their children, so creating barriers to them actually getting the help that they need. So what we're seeing is kind of, not to overstate it, but generations of, in this case, young people being separated from their children, and their children's children being apprehended as well, creating this intergenerational cycle of trauma and homelessness. Yeah, next slide, Leah. There's this really incredibly powerful quote from a woman in the Yukon explaining that my son is under social services. His social worker is the same social worker I had as a child. So when we're thinking about, at the very macro level, ending women's homelessness and violence against women across Canada, we need to be tackling the ways in which these public systems are creating pathways into homelessness and housing precarity. Okay, Opportunities. We are truly at a special moment, I think. I, I hope I'm not overly optimistic about this, but I think COVID-19 is requiring us to do some innovative and creative thinking in ways we haven't before, and creates the opportunity for the VAW and homelessness sector to come together and have some of these conversations around collaboration, coordination in ways we haven't. And I know Martine will speak to this more directly, but there are great models across the country in other sectors. Like, for example, I used to do a lot more work in the youth homelessness sector. And in Hamilton, there's the Street Youth Planning Collective, which is a collective of services serving young folks who are marginalized or experiencing homelessness that collaboratively meet and determine who's best positioned to apply for what funding, where the skills are and expertise are in terms of doing advocacy work, in terms of doing public education work, like highly deeply integrated. And I deeply hope for that for the VAW and homelessness sector at the hyper local level, but also more nationally, to be engaging in those conversations. Second, we have a commitment from the federal government that they are going to end chronic homelessness. This was in the throne speech. This is a huge potential opportunity for us to be working together and supporting the federal government to understand what does it mean to end chronic homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse folks. And part of it is, again, thinking about this definitional piece. Women's chronic homelessness looks really different if we're talking about hidden homelessness. If we're talking about the effects of gender-based violence for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks. And so I think both of our sectors have this opportunity to, where the feds have made this commitment, we can help articulate for them, what does this look like? And what are some of the best practices that likely many of you are engaged at the grassroots level or the local level. We also have this big commitment from the feds, $1 billion into the Rapid Housing Initiative. I imagine everyone on the call is quite familiar with it, so I won't go into great detail, but what I do know is that there is limited criteria around ensuring that a GBA plus lens is applied to the ways in which these funds are being distributed. So I think it's really important that some of the most incredible organizations, agencies that are serving women, girls, and gender diverse folks at the local level that have really powerful models, that they are given opportunities to access these funds in terms of acquiring properties, and that we support and push municipalities and the feds to be using a gender-based lens and thinking about how they're adjudicating applications. So I know that sounds like, getting in granular, but it really matters so much if we can push them to do this. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that we are in this new legislative framework in Canada around the right to housing. In June 2019, Canada declared that the right to housing should guide housing policy, all housing policy in this country. And so I think it's important for both of our sectors to come together and use that as a leveraging moment to think about ensuring that women's right to housing is secured across Canada, and that to help, again, the feds think through what this commitment actually means on the ground, and to be doing some collective advocacy and thinking together on that. So those are some of my thoughts. I'm really looking forward to Martine's thoughts and hearing from all of you. Such a pleasure to be here with Women's Shelters Canada, and honored by all the work that you folks do, truly. I'm just kind of a researcher, but you folks are doing the real work. So lovely to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. That was really, really interesting. Lots of great information in there. I'm just thinking, before we pass it over to Martine, there was there were two questions that were sort of specific clarifications on some of your slides. So I was just thinking maybe we could do those quickly now before we forget.
Love it. Love it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to back up here on the slides if I can figure out how to do that. One of the questions was about this quote. It sort of starts with, we had a case of two clients, and then describes the case of one of the clients.
Yes.
And someone was just wondering if you know what the other client's story was.
No, I don't. This was from a beautiful piece of research in the Yukon that Horenchek and Bop did. So I'm not sure what happened to the other client, but I think it's unfortunately these kinds of stories we came across constantly in our research. But unfortunately, I don't know what happened to the other person.
Great, thanks. And then the other one was about this map here. I think wondering like what kind of shelter you're referring to here, because someone had shared in Manitoba, they're aware of 10 provincially funded VAW shelters, and then I think it says 17 here.
Interesting. Yeah, I would have to go back to the study. What I'm gonna do is drop a link to the study in the chat box. Because this was an ESDC actually pulled together the statistics on this in 2018. So the numbers may have changed a little bit over the last 2 years. And I'm not entirely sure if they included transitional housing or not. So I'm going to drop a response to that in the chat as Martine's speaking, if that works.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Great.
Perfect. So thanks for that. And I know we do have other questions here. So those are sort of more general questions, or broader questions. We'll keep those to the end. I just wanted to kind of go through the ones that were really tied to specific slides. So without any further ado, I will pass it over to Martine.
Thank you very much. And I should have known better than to go after a researcher. That was just really incredible, Kaitlin, and your prowess in PowerPoint is truly amazing. Please don't expect that from my presentation, which I am attempting to share with you now. All right, hopefully this is showing the right view. Okay. So I wanted to talk, I've been invited to speak about the gaps and opportunities between violence against women and homeless shelters. So I'd like to just give you, a little bit of context. Sorry, this is right in my view. There we go, I'm gonna move it. So I'll give you my context here. So my comments are very specific to my experience and working within the Ottawa community. And I think almost half of you shared that you're working in shelters that service both VAW clients and women experiencing homelessness for other reasons. So not all of this may resonate for you, and so I apologize, but hopefully there's something that may hold a nugget for you. I'm going to highlight some of the situations and conditions and mind frames throughout the course of my career. And so it's not meant to criticize, it's merely to highlight what my experience has been. So I've been I started I went to school in my 30s as a single mom, and I started working at Cornerstone Housing for Women in 95. And Cornerstone Housing for Women, I worked at the emergency women's shelter serving women who were homeless. So it was very defined, the difference between homeless women and VAW women. During my years there, of course, as many of us did in the sector, always had a couple of jobs on the go. So I also worked at Interval House of Ottawa, a violence against women shelter. And I worked at Housing Help as well, which I find salient in that there I dealt with men and women, but women from both the homeless sector and the violence against women sector. In 2006, I went to work for a violence against women shelter, Chrysalis House, a program of Western Ottawa Community Resource Centre. And then in 2019, I came back to Cornerstone Housing for Women in a different role. But yeah, so I've been around a little bit. So speaking from my experience, I got to tell you, back in 1995, VAW and homelessness, they were very siloed. So there were a lot of gaps in the system. we rarely referred back and forth between the violence against women shelters and the homeless shelters. They were really seen as two different groups of women. I know working at that time in the homeless sector, you know, in a shelter serving women experiencing homelessness, we would not refer women with mental health or addictions issues to a violence against women shelter. Um, and in fact, on the front line, I have to say there was a bit of a hierarchy even around, you know, what clients were experiencing. And of course, they were funded at very different levels from different sources. Also in context in 1995, the gendered lens was not applied. So that difference in that public perception of deserving and undeserving women was very alive and real. So women were not seen as having value when they didn't have children. So if they were using single shelters that served single individuals, which was my experience, and they didn't have children, it wasn't seen in the same light as the deserving women who were fleeing domestic violence. Yeah, and there was really no violence against women's services or not great violence against women's services being provided in the shelters that were designated as homeless shelters. So I spoke about the difference in funding. So MCCSS or MCSS back then funded violence against women shelters, and the municipalities dispersed the federal funds for homelessness. Very little crossover. It was very siloed. But at the same time, our municipal funders were always supposed to provide that safety net, you know, that if homeless shelters couldn't accommodate everybody, if women fleeing violence couldn't be housed at a violence against women shelter and they couldn't be accommodated at a homeless shelter, we knew that the city was there to pick up that slack and put women in hotels. But in recent years, you know, we were challenged in the two sectors to start talking about bridging that gap. And so the conversation about whose responsibility are these women anyway, you know, became very real. And I do remember sitting around talking about, well, that's not a city responsibility, that's a ministry, you know, provincial ministry responsibility, and vice versa. So sometimes women were left in that gap between the two funders. But recently, there's been a little more traffic at the intersection of change and same old, same old. So there's been a lot of change factors. And again, I'm kind of speaking from on the ground experience at this point. Kaitlin spoke about the criteria used to screen women in or out of different shelters, and definitely women who use drugs or alcohol to cope with their trauma were often very disenfranchised from VAW shelters and sometimes even homeless shelters. So I remember back in 1995, we had a zero tolerance for women at our shelter, at our homeless shelter. So if a woman came to the door and she had alcohol in her breath, she was sent to detox for the night or sent to one of the mixed gender shelters. So the harm reduction movement that came to our both sectors was really important in starting to shift the tide of how we worked with women. And of course, incorporated in that is the move towards a trauma-informed lens. So once we understood the effects of trauma and we normalized them, it really made us aware that there's not our women or their women. They're just women, and they need us to all work together to ensure their needs are met. In 2014-15, in the violence against women sector, we started to talk about moving towards shelter standards. They rolled out in 2016. And they really formalized the direction that violence against women shelters were taking, in which they were increasing their capacity to work with women who had mental health issues and substance use issues. And I think that was start of the blending of the two sectors. With that increased understanding, we started to see those silos break down a little bit. In Ottawa, Canada 150 in 2017 was really the first time that we started to hear that safety net was eroding, and that when violence against women shelters were full and homeless shelters were full, and then we would go to that city for that safety net, we were starting to hear, no, there's nowhere for people to go. And that was also another sort of change factor that made VAW and homeless sectors really start engaging in earnest in the conversation about this isn't okay. Women should never be left with no options whatsoever. At the same time, this is when we really started to hear the concept that the ministries needed to become more collaborative, they needed to become less siloed, they needed to not worry about these strict criteria about these women fit into our criteria, these women fit into your criteria. So we had a bit of a dichotomy going on. So the flavor, was, oh, we're all going to work together. But at the same time, we were experiencing some really harsh barriers for women that we were trying to serve. Kaitlin referenced the 2018 point in time homeless enumeration count. And in Ottawa, that was the first time that violence against women were counted as part of the homeless population. And we were supposed to be doing it again in 2020. Obviously, COVID derailed that, and maybe it will happen in 2021, and maybe we'll have more violence against women shelters and statistics incorporated. But again, that it speaks to that siloing of, they often women's homelessness is hidden, and they are staying with abusers or couch surfing. And even when they were in VAW shelters, they weren't always being counted as homeless. And again, looking back to 1995, even in the homeless sector, we often had a little different opinion about women who went through the violence against women shelter, not an opinion about the women, but an opinion about, well, they have more opportunity for housing because they're going to get special priority and they're going to move into housing quickly. And of course, all of that has broken down as well, because that's not what we're experiencing. And of course, women who may not be able to prove that they lived with the abuser may not get accorded special priority. And then, the wait list is just getting longer and longer. So at the same time as the PIC count, we also that was the year in Ottawa that there was almost a 15% increase in the social housing registry wait list. So there's very much a crisis going on. And of course, the National Housing Strategy and the City of Ottawa's refresh to their 10-year plan to end homelessness have started to instigate some of the changes that are so necessary. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But what opportunities do we have right now? Well, it's harsh to say COVID is an opportunity, but it has highlighted the plight of all people without homes. And it has particularly shone a light on the plight of women who are living with relationship violence. And that's been very much highlighted in the news, and people are talking about it, I think, differently than they have before. Again, Kaitlin talked about the Rapid Housing Initiative, and it's really taking a human rights approach to housing. And when we talk about the RHI, along with the National Housing Strategy and our city's 10 years plan, they're starting to apply a human rights approach. They have been helpful, but at the same time, so they've named some of the vulnerable populations, such as women fleeing violence, persons with mental health issues or addictions, Indigenous folk, but they didn't go far enough to address the intersectionality. And they were often not specific enough, at least in the National Housing Strategy, about these are our goals, but how are we actually going to get there? And I think we're starting to refine that a little bit more in the Rapid Housing Initiative, in the refresh of the original Ottawa 10-year plan to end homelessness. And now we're starting to see violence against women and homeless sectors really working together and having those convening conversations and engaging in joint advocacy. So we're not trying to fight over the piece of the pie. We're all working together to say things need to change for women, for all women, and even for all persons. So that's really, really encouraging. I think there's opportunities for joint groups and ways to support women who are residing in the homeless shelters to receive better violence against women care. And I think that's happening again as even emergency shelters and supportive housing have gone down that road of harm reduction and trauma-informed care. I think those were providing better service to the women utilizing the services. And I wanted to talk briefly about one opportunity, one example of how we can work together. And here in Ottawa, we're working on a new housing development. It's part of the Anglican Diocese commitment to create 125 homes as they celebrate their 125th anniversary. And they are building a new housing development in which Cornerstone is going to be partnering with Chrysalis House as well. So a homeless serving organization and a violence against women shelter, where there's going to be units designated in this new housing development, some for women from Cornerstone, some for women from Chrysalis House, and then there'll be support provided to all of those women through Chrysalis House. So I think that's a really wonderful example of how we can work together and support all the women that we need to in this environment. And I just want to touch again, ending with a similar theme as Kaitlin, the City of Ottawa 10-year plan talks about the 5 conditions of collective impact, and they talk about having a common agenda. And I think we do. We've developed a common understanding of the needs, and we share a vision where all people have a home, all women have a home, and where they're getting the support they need and where they're working together. We're talking about shared measurement. So there is a lack of data, as Kaitlin referenced. We know we need to gather data and measure outcomes better. Our activities are mutually reinforcing. We're starting to support each other, and that's really important. Continuous communication, where the two sectors are now having those open conversations and sitting at the same tables more and more, and lots of skilled staff. I mean, it still comes down to there's what we provide and how we provide it, but we still need to continue to create more housing for women, and we need to support staff who are supporting the women in both sectors. And so that really comes down to partnership and collaboration again. So that's it for my presentation.
Awesome, thank you. Lots of really interesting information there too, and I think these were 2 really great complementary presentations. So thank you to both of you. Martine, you can stop your screen share. Thank you. So we do have some questions, and I'm going to jump right in just so we maximize the time that we have left together. And for those of you who still have questions, this is your opportunity to put them into the Q&A box. So the first question is, Kaitlin, you mentioned the idea that data collection on homelessness is contributing to invisibilizing women's homelessness. And so this person is wondering if you could give some recommendations or any ideas for ways that shelters can help to reverse that trend.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I see that Chris Mackey is also on this call and will have some probably great thoughts on this too. But part of the challenge is, how are we going to identify folks experiencing very particular forms of hidden homelessness? So for example, if you are a woman who's in an abusive relationship with your employer in the live-in caregiving program in Canada, how would we be able to include you in an understanding of the scale of housing need and homelessness across Canada? So, and this is, I think, in part where the real importance of peer leadership and research and collaboration is really key. This is a circuitous way of suggesting something, but one of the things that the Women's Network is doing right now is doing a national survey on women and girls and gender diverse folks' experiences of homelessness. And we're working with peer researchers in every province and territory across Canada to extend through their networks this survey that we're administering online, to try to reach women who aren't necessarily coming in and using services. So so a couple of thoughts. I think engaging peer leaders and community advocates in terms of what a hyper-local approach to data gathering might look like is important. I think that we need to also be doing a lot of advocacy with all levels of government around expanding the ways in which they're collecting data, ensuring that they are connecting with a whole range of organizations that are serving women in precarious housing situations. So a woman might be in a very precarious housing situation, but only accessing the food bank. She wouldn't be enumerated in homelessness. We need to be working across sectors to kind of be ensuring that the data collection that is ongoing at higher levels of government is connecting with those kind of services too. And then I also saw someone quite rightly pointed out in our chat here that some DV shelters in Quebec have a different understanding of what constitutes homelessness, and so they're not engaged in particular enumerations of it. So I think probably fostering a national conversation around what kind of standards do we want to use with respect to collecting data around women's housing need, and also thinking about all of the things that I know are front of mind for many of us around confidentiality, the OCAP principles with respect to Indigenous women and girls, like ownership of their own data, how to do that ethically. We certainly know data can be reversed to cause great harms to the communities we care about. So I'm not sure that totally answers your question. It's something I'm personally trying to think through and grapple with. Martine, I don't know, you might have some thoughts as well. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I said I lost the thread on that because I was trying to read the chats, and I know I was told not to do that, that Leah would look after that. So
no worries.
No problem.
What I'm gonna do is drop my email in the chat too. I'm sure, or maybe Leah, you have a plan for this.
Yeah, I can send, we'll send the PowerPoints, and we can send your contact info around to everyone afterwards, and maybe the link to that study as well with the numbers, because there's been some ongoing discussion about those numbers on that map, so people might be interested in that.
Perfect.
To continue with some of the questions, there is a question about so someone sharing an experience that the extreme lack of subsidized housing means that their second stage transitional housing program is really bogged down. Women and children end up staying longer because there's nowhere to go. So just wondering about initiatives out there to increase kind of they say MB housing, maybe that's Manitoba housing, not sure, but just the housing options open for women leaving shelters, because that's an issue across the country. So either of you, if you're aware of initiatives around that.
I do not, and this has been a sore spot for us for quite a while, in that there's just nowhere for people to go. We're completely jammed up with traffic, and sometimes I get frustrated and I think I don't want one more study pointing out that there's a lack of housing. We just need more housing. We need bricks and mortar. And I'm hopeful that the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is not only designating money, but saying it has to be rapid. It has to be, it's looking at opportunities to buy properties where there is already zoning in place, or properties that are not currently being used for housing, and convert them. And very tight timelines. They're talking about, from approval, one round of applications goes in by the end of November, one by the end of December. Once the decision is made sort of in March, and people are, organizations are awarded these grants, they're expecting the housing to be ready to go in 1 year. So they're looking at strategies like modular homes, modular construction, where like an apartment building can be constructed individually. Individual units can be constructed, brought in, and then sort of stacked, and all the electrical and plumbing hooked up. So they're really looking at quick builds. So I'm hopeful that that will start to ease the gridlock a little bit.
And go ahead, Kaitlin.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly add, and I'm going to add a link in the chat too. With respect to the Rapid Housing Initiative, and I see, thanks Chris for your question on this as well. It is so central. It is so, I want to echo your point, Martine, with respect to the amount of labor that has gone into creating research and studies and reports and advocacy. Like, we just, the need has been demonstrated again and again and again. So I think the opportunity we're facing right now is around the Rapid Housing Initiative. So a week or two ago, myself and a few other great folks came together to kind of convene a conversation with CMHC. So Emily Parody and Layla at Campaign 2000 and Carolyn Witzman brought together, I think maybe 40 or 50 folks, to try to pressure CMHC around the importance of a GBA plus lens in how they allocate the Rapid Housing Initiative funds. And I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say, for any of you who are really interested in doing some of that advocacy work with us, or helping think through what that could look like locally, be super ecstatic to connect with you, because this was just, honestly, it was like a Twitter thread that became a meeting, and then CMHC agreed to come. And anyway, so it kind of became this opportunity. But the other thing I wanted to drop in the chat too is the Canadian Housing Transformation Centre. Perhaps everyone's aware, but they're providing grants to help groups prepare their applications. So this is an amazing resource, but it's really integral that the way this funding rolls out meets the needs of women across Canada.
That's great. And I think maybe, Kaitlin, we can connect afterwards, and I can include maybe a little description of that conversation or the group that you've just spoken about in the email afterwards.
Yes.
And that way people who do want to kind of get involved can connect with you to do that.
100%.
Awesome. So we are coming to the end of our session here. I see there's a few people who've shared experiences or thoughts in the Q&A. So I just want to share some of those too, to get them to get that out there. And so someone who has mentioned that, some of the funding differences that influence how these sectors are different in terms, I think this is from Quebec, for example, but domestic violence being funded through health, and then homelessness being seen as housing. And so creating a bit of a distance there. And someone from the York Region area, so north of Toronto, saying at a meeting of landlords, they were asked, or based on a quick survey there, that domestic violence families and youth are the two least likely groups that landlords are interested in renting to. Yep. And so definitely another issue there that sort of cuts across the sectors.
Yes.
So maybe I will wrap it up there because I know we're at 3 o'clock here or wherever it is in your time zone. So I just want to say thank you once again to Kaitlin and Martine for those wonderful presentations, and to all of the people listening. Those were great questions that came in. Thanks for sharing those experiences. And we will follow up, as I said, in an email with some resources and further information. So thank you.